Hello everyone, and welcome to our video lecture for our unit on culture. You see here the objectives for this video lecture. First off, we'll be looking at value systems, particularly two main kind of global value systems, individualism and collectivism, and looking at some of the distinct characteristics of each. Next, we will examine more deeply some of the work done by Max Weber in his book called Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and kind of look at how Protestantism aligns with individualistic values to some degree. Okay, so first off, we should go ahead and define values. This is, I think, a very similar definition to what you'll see in your text. But values we can describe as important and lasting beliefs about what is right and wrong, desirable and undesirable in a given social context. So of course values are fluid, they change over time, they relate to social structure, and as social structure changes, so do values. Values are, though I should say, more static than norms and many other forms of non-material culture, meaning that they don't change as rapidly. So values take a long time to evolve unless you have dramatic kind of social changes, and we'll look at some examples of that. But one example could be social revolution. So, you know, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 transformed Russian society into a communist society and included some major shifts in value systems. And okay, so moving forward, though, we will be, as I mentioned previously, discussing individualism and collectivism. I'm going to start, though, by giving you a definition of individualism. So this is, in fact, a definition of individualism that was refined or developed by Hofstede. Hofstede was a cultural anthropologist who went into the private sector and has a consulting firm that looks at values, culture, and advises businesses on intercultural communication. So Hofstede defines individualism as a preference for a loosely knit social framework in which individuals are expected to take care of only themselves and their immediate families. So of course this definition mentions the social framework, which is described as loosely knit. So this is, you know, not an incredibly loosely knit network. This doesn't mean people don't have social connections. It just means that the social framework is more loosely knit than in a collectivistic society, and social cohesion is probably a bit lower than in a collectivistic society. It also mentions here in the definition the expectation for care. So in an individualistic society, people are expected generally to take care of themselves first and foremost, and potentially their immediate families. And when we say immediate families, we probably mean here kind of nuclear family. You know, nuclear family being the kind of archetypal definition of family from the 1950s, parents with their children living in their own kind of self-contained single-family residence. Of course, this definition is malleable, and it's, you know, not generalizable to all individualistic cultures. You know, every society, I think, represents this kind of value system, or this description of the value system, to varying degrees, dependent upon the social structure that exists there. Another component, though, of individualism is that personal achievements are paramount. You know, this is how one distinguishes themselves within an individualistic society, and when success is achieved within an individualistic society, generally the individual who achieves it is given credit for that achievement, is recognized for that achievement. And this might be distinct from a collectivistic society where, say, the entire community could actually share recognition, or at the very least, a whole family shares recognition for the achievements of an individual. In an individualistic society, your successes are generally your own, although this is also true of the converse. Failures are generally seen as the individual's responsibility. So there's the expectation, of course, of kind of owning up to our failures. Although that does mean that just like our successes might not be shared by our community or our family, neither are failures. This, is kind of a social structure where there may be less social stigma and shame placed on whole groups of people for the failures of one single individual. Of course, individual rights are central here. So, and this is opposed to, say, collective rights. We'd be looking at individual rights, so individual property rights, individual rights to free speech. All of these things are going to be emphasized within an individualistic social structure. Whereas in a collectivistic social structure, there may be, more of a willingness to make sacrifices on individual rights to ensure the greater good of the community. Individualistic societies tend to tolerate nonconformity to a greater extent than collectivistic ones. So that means that there is this kind of tolerance for alternative lifestyles, identities, aesthetic appearances that may not exist in collectivistic societies. So, for example, and of course, I don't think this is universally true, and there's nuance to this. But take tattoos, for example, are quite normalized in the United States or in Western societies, and don't necessarily evoke a negative stigma for the individual who has tattoos. But in a place like Japan that's more collectivistic, tattoos might be discouraged, might be looked down upon, and might even be associated with kind of a deviant status or a criminal status in the extreme. That's one example of how conformity to social norms is emphasized, in fact, in collectivistic societies, and maybe de-emphasized to some degree in individualistic ones. And of course, individualistic societies also are characterized by a high level of individualistic thinking. This means, to connect with C. Wright Mills' sociological imagination, the idea you looked at last week in the video lecture and in the readings, that many in individualistic societies are kind of prone to private troubles perspectives. So once again, getting back to achievements and failures, blaming people for their failures, and of course crediting them for their success is quite common. Now, of course, that has implications for wider social structure, for decision making, and the kind of top of the social hierarchy, all of those things that we'll have to get into more detail a bit later in the lecture. Next, I'd like to discuss collectivism. I've been talking about collectivism, kind of mentioning it peripherally and providing some comparisons, but now we should look into this concept a bit more deeply and, of course, provide a definition. So collectivistic societies, as opposed to orientations primarily focused around the individual, the orientation might be around the group. So this could be a family group, a community group, a tribal group, any kind of group, ethnic group, cultural group, where there exists social cohesion and social interaction between members of the group. Excuse me. So here's a definition from Hofstede for collectivism. Hofstede writes that collectivism involves a preference for a tightly knit framework in society in which individuals can expect their relatives or members of a particular in-group to look after them in exchange for unquestioning loyalty. This makes a couple of assumptions about collectivism. First is that it's a tightly knit social framework, meaning that people are close together. Not necessarily that they're interacting more than people in individualistic societies, or that they're living in closer proximity. That may be true or that may not be true, but that there is a kind of tightly woven social framework where individuals hold each other accountable, so to speak, for their actions and potentially even their thoughts and attitudes. So a tightly knit social framework. And of course, in this social framework, people can expect to be supported. Their relatives, other members of their group, will support them if possible, but of course this support is only available in exchange for unquestioning loyalty. So this is loyalty that has no morality. We hope that the loyalty is to someone or some group that is acting morally, but this could involve loyalty to an unmoral or unethical actor as well, but unquestioning loyalty being the key defining feature. Collectivistic societies tend to emphasize harmony in social relationships. So maintaining a kind of balance and harmony and equilibrium in communities and social relationships is key here. Avoiding imbalances, avoiding discord is going to be something that collectivistic societies are oriented around, whereas individualistic societies may have a higher tolerance for conflict, dissenting viewpoints. Collectivistic societies are going to expect, right, that type of loyalty that contributes to harmonious social relationships. And to talk about conformity a bit, so we mentioned that in individualistic societies, nonconformity is tolerated. In collectivistic societies, we see less tolerance for nonconformity, so people are pressured through rigid social norms, the potential for social sanctions and social stigma for nonconformity is significant, and this results in kind of higher levels of conformity to social norms. So you may see fewer dissenting viewpoints, opposition being discouraged. You may not see a kind of radical differences in thought among members of the same in-group. You may see even aesthetic similarities, visual similarities between members of the group in a collectivistic society, more often than you would in an individualistic society or community. And in many collectivistic societies, filial duty is emphasized. Filial duty meaning the kind of duty of children to their parents. There is a kind of respect for elders that's embedded within collectivism, and you see that in some of the expectations that are placed upon young people in collectivistic society. So for instance, in China there's a pretty strong expectation that sons financially care for their parents later in life to maybe a greater degree than we see here in Western societies or in the United States. This is an emphasis within China, and China of course has a collectivistic orientation. But don't take my word for it. Let's look at some data on different societies and their levels of individualism and collectivism.